Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, brothers and sisters, and a warm welcome to the Great Debate. My name is Ahmad Uddin. I'm the chairman of the Great Debate, and I welcome you to our event. Today we have a lineup of distinguished panel, and I'm very pleased that they have been able to join us. I want to thank Professor Hugh Kennedy for accepting to come down, and Brother Jamal Harwood as well. And I hope tonight will be a fruitful discussion on the Caliphate and its viability in the Middle East. For our information, this event is being streamed live at the Great Debate 1. You can on Facebook, and also on our website www.thegreatdebate.co.uk. You can find out all the details and our future events. Without further delay, I'll pass you on to our chairperson for the night, Dili Hussain, who will be going through the logistics, the whole event tonight, inshallah.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. I begin by greeting you all with the warmest Islamic greeting, the greeting of peace. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I would also like to thank the organizers for inviting me to chair this discussion, important discussion which has dominated media headlines, news bulletins, and remains at the back of the minds of millions upon millions of Muslims and non-Muslims alike, and that is whether the Caliphate is a viable alternative in the Middle East. The region, which is commonly known as the Middle East, and by extension North Africa, is a region which for the past 100 to 150 years has witnessed some of the worst civil wars, foreign invasions, economic instability, and political turmoil. However, the very same region, prior to this recent period of death and destruction, for centuries enjoyed a relative degree of peace, political security, and economic prosperity under rulers and dynasties who claimed to have established the Caliphate. Now, I'm fully aware of the various arguments that question the religious and political legitimacy of the Caliphate throughout history, as well as questions pertaining to how long this polity actually lasted and the numerous claimants of this institution at one given time. And these are valid questions which we can perhaps seek to address later on in the event. However, this evening's discussion is fundamentally about the viability of the Caliphate as an alternative governing system for the Middle East, as understood and agreed upon within the Islamic framework, and whether it can practically manifest in the modern era of the nation state. Lastly, the word Caliphate or Islamic State are terms which resonate in the hearts and minds of millions of Muslims and non-Muslims. Here in the Western world, the conception of the Caliphate or Islamic State is perceived with much negativity and suspicion in the dominant narrative surrounding the war on terror. And that is that the Caliphate is ultimately a backward, medieval, illiberal, barbaric, expansionist empire which has surpassed its sell-by date in the modern world. However, in the minds of many Muslims, the conception of a caliphate is a nostalgic, somewhat romanticized, and even a realistic alternative to what currently exists and what may well emerge in the future. And this is exemplified by the recent calls and actions of a number of Muslim organizations and movements who seek to reestablish this institution in the Muslim majority world. Ladies and gentlemen, it is within this framework and context that today's discussion will take place. And just to set out today's itinerary, there will be two short addresses from our distinguished speakers, and there will be a brief panel discussion between myself and two speakers. Then we'll open the floor up to the audience as well as viewers online, and then hopefully we should conclude with some closing remarks and break and conclude for 8:45. So ladies and gentlemen, without any further delay, I would like to introduce Professor Hugh Kennedy. Just to say a bit about the good professor, he's a British medieval academic professor of Arabic studies at the London University of SOAS. He specializes in the history of the early Islamic Middle East, Muslim Spain, and the Crusades. This is his book.
Latest book.
We get that picture. And he's the author of numerous books, including When Baghdad Ruled the World, The Rise and Fall of Islam's Greatest Dynasty, The Great Arab Conquest, How the Spread of Islam Changed the World We Live In, and The Caliphate, A Pelican Introduction, which is this book. So without any further delay, Professor.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I hope you can all hear me. Are we Can you hear me at the back there? Good, good. And it's very nice to be here. I'll explain a bit about myself and why I come to be here and what my interest is, and make a few points. I'm a historian. I'm a historian of the Arab culture and society, Islamic culture and society, in the first 4 centuries of Islam primarily. So I am very engaged with the Arabic language sources, the Arabic language chronicles and so on, which discuss the early Islamic world, and that's what I teach my students in ZOAS, is how we read these chronicles, how we understand these chronicles, what they can tell us about the society and culture in which they originated. And so naturally, and particularly as a result of, in the light of current negotiation or current conversations amongst Muslims and non-Muslims alike, we've just been hearing about, I am drawn to study the role of the Caliphate, the emergence of the Caliphate. And I think a lot of discussion about Caliphate, what it should be, and so on, hinges on and devotes itself to the early centuries of Islam. How did this institution emerge? In what ways, and what were the issues that it gave rise to? And I'm coming to this, as I said before, but I want to emphasize this through the medium of Arab Muslim historical writers. And it's their interpretations and so on which guide the way that I am presenting this. And I think there's another point, or another 2 points I want to make. The first is right from the very beginning, right from the moment when Prophet Muhammad died, there were different views about what Caliphate should be. These go right back to the origins of the institution, to the earliest days of Islam, and they're reflected in our sources. And the second point that leads from that is that Muslims, through the centuries, have developed very different ideas about 2 absolutely key issues about Caliphate. Who should be the Caliph, and how the Caliph should be chosen, on the one hand, and secondly, what powers does the Caliph have, and in particular, what powers should the Caliph have in a very crucial issue. And this very crucial issue is the authority and the leadership in understanding the word of Almighty God and how God wishes us to live our lives in the world. And the fundamental question that is the fundamental question for Muslims and Christians alike: how do I live the good life? How do I live a life that is pleasing to God in this world? And these are the real issues that the debate about Caliphate is concerned. You may read history books that is all about fanatical people fighting each other and so on and so forth. But actually these are real issues that go right to the root of human existence and human relationships with the divine. Let's start off by just suggesting there are 2 very broadly different points of view which emerge in the first half century of Islam. As everyone knows, the sources for this period are very complicated and they don't always tell the same story. But by and large, the question is, firstly, who should the Caliph be? And we'll start off by looking at what we could call, I think, the Sahabi or Proto-Sunni view of who the Caliph should be. And this comes back to the time when Prophet Muhammad died, and a group of the closest, the Sahaba of Prophet Muhammad, from the Quraysh and so on, took control of the Muslim community, believing that Prophet Muhammad himself had not made any clear designation about the successorship. He hadn't pointed at anybody who would succeed him. And they realized that the Muslim community needed leadership, and they realized that the Muslim community needed a leadership quickly, because there were threats and divisions beginning to appear with the death of the Prophet. And so they assumed that the Sahaba in general, and particularly the Quraysh group, should decide that one of theirs was going to have authority over the Muslim community, to lead it primarily in the fight for survival. and primarily in the military campaigns, but also in other decision-making campaigns. And we could talk about, if you want to, the real choices that faced the Muslim community at this crucial person. So the idea was that the leader would be chosen by the Muslims. It wasn't clear which Muslims, was all Muslims, some Muslims, but the important point is that it was the leader should be chosen by the Muslims, and that therefore his powers were limited by the fact that he had been chosen by the Muslim community, by the Ummah in general. But right from the beginning, there was another point of view. And the other point of view was that it was the family, the Ahlul Bayt, the family of Prophet Muhammad, who God had chosen. God had chosen this particular family of all the other families in the world to provide his messenger, and therefore the authority within the Muslim community should lie with the family of Prophet Muhammad. And we can talk about this as a proto-Shi'i point of view, if you like, that the differences, as a historian it seems to me, that the differences between Sunnis and Shi'is is not something that really becomes defined and really becomes articulated until about 200 or 300 years after the death of Prophet Muhammad. Nonetheless, these ideas are here. And right from the beginning, of course, is the idea that the leader from the family of Prophet Muhammad had been appointed not by man, not by the Ummah, but by Almighty God. The Caliph, in this vision of leadership and so on, was the God-appointed ruler of the Muslims. And these are both, as I've said, serious, legitimate points of view. There are different points of view about how we interpret God's will for humankind in general, and in this case for the Muslim community in particular. And these issues have dominated the discussion of the Caliphate ever since. And what are the issues of authority that we're talking about? Well, the issues of everyday management, if you like, and military leadership and so on, but crucially, it's the question of who do you look to answer those questions about how do I be a good Muslim? Do you look, and this both emerges generally, do you look to a Khalifa, a Caliph, a leader, or do you look to the seerah of Prophet Muhammad, the sunnah of Prophet Muhammad, and the sunnah encounter, of course, both the seerah, the life of Prophet Muhammad, and the hadith, the traditions of Prophet Muhammad. And these two versions, if you go along, as it were, the Shi'i Ahlul Bayt route, then it's clear. If you want to know the answer to questions about what Muslims do in difficult situations where neither Quran nor Hadith are particularly clear, why then you look to the Imam Caliph, who is the representative of the family of the Prophet. If you go down the Sahabi route, if you go down the proto-Sunni route, of course, you look to a different source. You look to the hadiths of Prophet Muhammad as interpreted by the scholars, muhaddithun, the ulama, call them what you like, who know about these things. It's to them that you look when you want to know the answers to these questions. And that is the fundamental debate about the nature of caliphate and whether the caliph is God's representative on earth, a sort of semi-divine kingship, if you like. I don't want to, that's a rather sort of Christian framing of this issue, or whether the real authority within the community lies with the scholars who know the hadith, and the caliph is, as it were, the chief executive of the Muslim society, but not the person, not the authority to whom you look. And I could go on about the different ways in which both these points of view are emerged and developed, the way in which the crisis of the Abbasid Caliphate in the 10th century, when the Caliphate seems to be powerless and directionless, provokes a whole new, amongst the Ahl Sunnah, provides a whole new discussion about who should be the caliph and so on, because the old Abbasid dynasty was plainly failing in the lives of many Muslims to do this sort of thing. I could go on to talk about the revival of the caliphate much later on, but I only have a few minutes to talk to. Got 5 more?
Yeah.
Gosh.
Really generous.
You are. And I could go down the route of looking at the Shi'i view of the caliphate and the way different. The idea that the caliph, the leader of the Muslim community, should be a direct descendant of Ali and Fatima through their younger son Hussein, the martyr of Karbala, of course, itself gives rise to all sorts of problems. It may seem a simple thing, the eldest son of the eldest son, what could be plainer than that? But in terms of the way human biology works, if you like, this is not necessarily the case. Just a single solitary example from one of many. What happens when the son of the 6th Imam Ja'far Sadiq, who dies in 762, I think, of the Common Era, dies before his father? What is God telling us about the succession when he allows such an event to happen? Is God saying, as the 12 Imami Shi'is argue, that the eldest son, Ismail, was for whatever reason unsuitable, was not God's choice, and therefore the community should look to his younger brother, Musa al-Qasim? Or, as the people who still call themselves Ismailis would argue, God chose the eldest son, and it must be the children of the eldest son because that is the word of God. And you see how these issues that at one level you can see it just like sort of family quarrel or something, actually raise real issues about this fundamental question: how do we interpret the will of God for human society? And this is why people are arguing. And there's another thing which I'll finish off with this because my 5 minutes are trickling away. But I shall finish off by talking about the implications of Imami, 12 Isna Ashari Shi'ism, the Shi'ism of Iran and much of Iraq, with regard to the disappearance of the Caliph Imam in the course of the early 10th century. The Caliph Imam disappears, but he's not dead. The 12th Imam still, for these people, still exists with us in the world. We can't communicate with him directly, though there are people who think that they can understand the will of the 12th Imam. We can't communicate with the 12th Imam, but he is still the Hujjat al-Islam. He's the proof of Islam. Without the 12th Imam, there cannot be any true Islam. Why is this important for this particular discussion that we're having this evening? It's important when we're considering ideas of revival of the Caliphate, because for the Imam Shi'is, who offer a large proportion of, a significant proportion of the Muslims of the Middle East, there is no vacancy. There is a Caliph. There is no scope, therefore, for a caliphal revival. And I think one of the things that those who want to revive the caliph, an issue that is going to be very, very important, is the question of how do these 2 points of view get reconciled. So I'll just finish up, and I really will finish up now. Just say there are lots of different ways of looking at caliphate, which pious Muslims, believing Muslims have generated through the centuries as a way of solving the problems or the questions that arise, working out what God's will for humanity is. And I think that this whole debate should respect these different points of view. These are genuine, pious, honest inquirers who have come to different solutions. That's what people do in whatever religion, in whatever environment. And I think any discussion about the revival of the caliphate, or generation of the new caliph, has to take into account and respect these points of view. Ladies and gentlemen, I shall keep quiet now, and thank you very much.
Sorry, Diggy, I'm just wary that it's glaring at you there. I'm trying to
Professor Kennedy, thank you very much for that informative historical insight into the history of the Caliphate, which I'm sure we can elaborate on some points that you raised later on in the cross-panel discussion. Our second speaker, Jamal Harwood, is a executive committee member of Islamic political party Hizb ut-Tahrir Britain. He's the author of numerous political and economic articles, The Gold Standard, countering poverty, causes and solutions for the financial crisis. He has debated with former UK cabinet ministers regarding economy in Islam and the role of Muslims in the UK, to name Norman Lamont, Peter Lilly, Dominic Grieve. He was also the subject of Time magazine's feature in August 2006. He's also been active in local and global politics, speaking throughout the UK and globally, including Financial Crisis Conference in Sudan in January 2009 and major conferences in the Middle East, Pakistan, the US and around Europe. So without any further delay, Jamal.
Thank you, Dilly, and a very special thank you to Hugh Kennedy for giving us some of his time this evening on this most important topic. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Assalamu alaikum, and a very good evening to you all. Is the Caliphate a viable alternative for the Middle East today? The question tonight is whether it is viable. Can its structures, its rules, its traditions solve the modern day problems which are besetting the region? I believe it can. If we look from the time of Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam until now, 95% approximately of that time was under the institution of the Caliphate, Islam's ruling system. But despite the decline in its terminal years, the devastation hitting the region since its abolition in 1924, I would argue, has been more devastating. The division into small, unnatural, colonially controllable statelets, the wholesale extraction and ongoing control of its many resources, the unleashing of sectarian divisions, and now the recent specter of uncontrolled and anti-Islamic violence in the guise of wars and terrorism. The motley crew of despots ruling the region along nationalist and autocratic lines. The impacts of all of the above being far worse than the effort that was required to reverse the Caliphate's decline. This was perhaps predictable. Quoted in the Times of the 4th of March 1924 was a prominent Indian Muslim and supporter of the Caliphate, Amir Ali. And he said the abolition of the Caliphate, and I quote, "But so much I can safely affirm, it will prove a disaster both to Islam and to civilization. The suppression of this time-honored institution, which was throughout the Muslim world regarded as a symbol of Islamic unity, will cause the disintegration of Islam as a moral force." That was his quote in the Times, 1924, 4th of March. So we are left with Islam's beliefs and values, but where is its governance? This discussion is really about the future. Is it, the Caliphate, a viable solution? It's all about solutions. Does Islam and Caliphate have the answers to the instability in Syria or Libya? Is it an alternative to the oppressive regimes of the House of Saud or al-Sisi of Egypt? The decades-long conflict over Palestine, the ability to reconcile Muslims, Jews, Christians, and others, the stifling wealth imbalances. These are the problems of today. I will make 3 points in my short address. My first point is about leadership. Islamic governance resets the region to its natural order, in accordance with the people's beliefs and historical experience, rather than the unnatural post-Sykes-Picot status. The post-Caliphate period was dominated by colonial regimes propped up by Britain, France, and the US. These have morphed into the most despotic autocratic systems. Even as a Gaddafi or a Saddam departs, a Sisi or Assad takes their place. The replacement of monarchs, nationalists, autocrats, and opportunists will not be solved by trying to impose a system alien to the beliefs and values of the vast majority of the people. Secular liberal democracy has no history in the region and is incompatible with belief in God's law implemented by an elected and accountable caliph. Islam is the essential belief and character of the people of the Middle East. So it is no surprise that survey after survey, like the University of Maryland in 2007, or more recent Pew studies like that presentation, the video earlier, report that the Arab populations overwhelmingly seek a return to Sharia law under the Caliphate system. They showed, that video mentioned 70s to 90% support levels for Sharia law as an example. Of course, the Arab Spring gave strength to the feeling that political change was essential, yet sadly has yet to be achieved. I would put to you that Caliphate means a caliph which is elected and accountable to all. A strong emphasis on the rule of law, the Islamic law. A representative and transparent government, including the Council of the Ummah, including peoples of all faiths, male and female, and an independent judiciary with Islamic political parties which are not part of the ruling system but are there to account the caliph and others in positions of authority. Very distinctive and very unique. But what about, my second point now, is what about the plethora of sects and different religions that exist today in this region? Whose Islam will dominate? Professor Kennedy highlighted, quite rightly, Shia Sunni aspects. Let's look at sectarianism for a moment. The core position of Islam is to accept that there will be differences of opinion. Hence the various main schools of thought and Islam's very open position on citizenship. The caliph will accept peoples of all faith to live within the state, provided they respect the rule of law. This does not mean that they have to believe in the source of that law. The state should not interfere in beliefs. Yes, there was at times brief interference by a caliph. For example, was the Quran the word of Allah or created? But this is the exception rather than the rule. And we have learnt by these mistakes. We will look back on this particular period of history as fondly with the likes of David Cameron, demanding far more than respect for the rule of law with his muscular liberalism, meaning believing in all of the values and principles of secularism rather than just respecting the rule of law. Islam does not demand adherence to its creed by its citizens. The existence of many Christian and Jewish communities and their places of worship and protection afforded by the state over centuries is a clear evidence for this. And I would just give one quote. Sir Thomas Arnold, in his book, The Call to Islam, he said, and I quote, "We have never heard about any attempt to compel non-Muslim parties to adopt Islam or about any organized persecution aiming at exterminating Christianity. If the caliphs had chosen one of these plans, they would have wiped out Christianity as easily as what happened to Islam during the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain, by the same method which Louis XIV followed to make Protestantism a creed whose followers were to be sentenced to death, or with the same ease of keeping the Jews away from Britain for a period of 350 years. Of course, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he said, as in the book of At-Tabarani, he who hurts a dhimmi, a non-Muslim citizen of the state, hurts me, and he who hurts me annoys Allah. Of course, the Quran in Surah Al-Baqarah La ikrah fi din. There is no compulsion in the deen. So the prophetic example, and that of the Rashidun Caliphate, is that access to justice, security, education, shelter, food and clothing was a right for all citizens. Sectarianism and separatism thrives when communities have political grievances, feeling that they are left out, whereas a constitutional Islamic state gives the rights to all citizens. My third point, my last point, economy. To describe Islam's economic and ruling system features in a few minutes is impossible. But let me put forth just one example of how the mismanagement of resources we witness in the growing wealth inequalities we see across this region, the Middle East. Islam clearly defines public properties to include oil, gas, and the vast mineral resources which we are blessed with. Yet as long as these can be monopolized, for example, by the tiny yet wasteful Gulf statelets, there will be no sustainable solving of poverty in the many countries not sharing in these resources. Poverty and famine were extremely rare occurrences in the Caliphate. And the next Caliphate, not only would the zakat be properly shared, but the oil revenues, the agricultural resources, and manpower will be more appropriately spread throughout what is a vast and diverse and very wealthy area. So in conclusion, I put forward to you for discussion, change is clearly required in the Middle East. But the solution should be in concordance with the beliefs and values of the region. And it should not be exposed externally, as some have tried and failed. So in summary, I say that, yes, the next caliphate can be viable. Yes, it will be. But more importantly, without it, I cannot see an end to the circular misery that affects the people of the region and the instability that is sending waves across the world. Thank you.
Jamal, thank you very much for that more a contemporary understanding for the need and the viability of the caliphate in today's world. Now, if you don't mind, I'm going to kick off the panel discussion from here, as you both are privileged to a mic and I'm not. So if I can kindly ask you that you bring the mic towards yourselves. Professor Kendi, you made a point in your address about early differences with regards to successionship and leadership. And if I understood correctly, and correct me if I am wrong, you indicated a kind of lack of consensus.
Yes, I think there is. Sorry, can you hear me? I think this microphone is on. There is a lack of consensus, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, I think that these are really difficult issues. Sorry, these are really difficult issues for believers in both Islam and Christianity. What should be the nature of authority and so on? Of course, there are different points of view. And we shouldn't necessarily, I think, and just in general, think different points of view are necessarily a bad thing. This is the way that human societies discuss these things. And the Word of God, for again, it comes both Christians and Muslims, the Word of God is not always clear. And the Christian phrase that God speaks in a mysterious way is divine decisions and divine guidance needs to be elucidated, needs to be discussed. And human beings, being, as we all are, prone to have our own opinions and not share other people's, there are always going to be different opinions. But I think that any, the attempt to revive the Caliphate, it's very, very important that these differences are respected, because these are not anti-Muslim, these are not blasphemous people, they are honest and genuine people who nonetheless have different opinions about very important issues.
Okay, so on that point, I then pose to Jamal, in light of differences that did exist for centuries, be it Sunni, Shia, Umayyad, Abbasids, later Ottomans, Safavid. So these kind of differences did exist. How do you envisage the reconciliation of these differences, which still exist, in a modern day caliphate?
Yes, I echo the point that Professor Kennedy mentioned, which is that we should not look at differences of opinion as fatal. You know, oh, woe is us, there's two opinions on the matter. The reality is that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, there was differences even in his time. So, for example, the Bani Qurayza hadith, when he said, do not pray Asr until you reach Bani Qurayza. And again, one group of the Muslims took one view and another took another. So the point is that we can see that... Mic's not working. So what we can see is that there was differences of opinion. And look at the four main schools, or even the Jafri school. You know, we have many schools of thought. So rather than, in fact, more likely when people tried to close the gates of ijtihad, we saw more problems then, when people said, nah, we've kind of reached the forte, we've reached our pinnacle, no more need for ijtihad, was actually a mistake in retrospect. So the point is that one would need debate and discussion and scholarly inquiry throughout all periods of time, now and into the future. But in the Caliphate system, we will see a debate amongst the public, amongst scholars and others, and indeed amongst the Caliph or others who are in positions of authority. We, for example, as a political movement, we put forward our opinion in various books. We put forward, for example, a draft constitution. We said it's a draft constitution for the Islamic State, for the Caliphate Khilafah. But we didn't say this is the constitution for the Khilafah. And in fact, indeed, within that constitution, we put forward a variety of opinions from classical schools of Islamic thought. So we should not look at this as being a game changer. And the last point I'll say is that if we look at Britain today, we can see a debate going on, and I would say that I can see some differences between, for example, Theresa May and Jeremy Corbyn, although they might call themselves secular, liberal Democrats, but there are certainly some differences in terms of their opinions and approach.
Thank you. Jamal, during your address, you kind of posited a reality of the Middle East, very problematic, political turmoil, quite a daunting reality of the region. And then you presented this caliphate, which does not exist at the moment, and kind of alluded to that this is a solution for the region. Professor Kennedy, do you, from your academic studies and vast research into this topic matter, do you think that the caliphate, as indicated by Jamal, may well address the issues of the region?
Yes, I think so. I think Jamal's analysis of the Middle East and the problems there is very compelling, and I'm broadly speaking very sympathetic to it. I think that the caliphate is an idea with a lot of potential, but we shouldn't underestimate at the same time the problems. I'm interested in. I first started visiting the Middle East in the 1960s.
Professor,
and in the
can you tell me about some of those problems? Sorry to interject.
No, sorry. I'm just sorry. This is a slightly relevant point. In that, in those days, the ideas that animated particularly young people in the Middle East were two. They were Arab nationalism and socialism as learnt from the Soviet Union. Those were the ideas that were going to take the Middle East forward. Now, of course, we moved into a completely different environment, and a completely different thoughtful environment. And the idea of caliph is, in terms of major discussions in amongst people in the Middle East, both very ancient and comparatively new. In those days, in the 1960s, nobody talked about reviving the caliphate any more than Europeans talk about reviving the Holy Roman Empire. It was, and as Jamal was saying at the beginning, there was a sort of nostalgic view of it, but it was something in the past, and we'd moved on. Now we're back with the caliphate. But because it's, in a sense, a new and effectively untried idea, we're not entirely sure about what the problem's going to be. Clearly, there are going to be very difficult debates about the choice of the Khalifa. Is it going to be a choice through the ballot box or through popular opinion or whatever? The traditions of the Caliphate don't give us much guidance about this. In practice, caliphates have basically been hereditary succession has been the guiding principle, even though it is mediated through the idea of nas, the idea of that is of designation by the previous caliph, and ideas of shura, the ideas of consultation have existed, but actually very seldom, if ever, put into practice. Then there is another question that runs through debates about the caliph. Does the caliph have to be from Quraysh? And this is a debate that goes right the way through the discussion of caliphate from time of Prophet Muhammad down to the present day. And the Daesh people insist, amongst other things, that the only true caliph can be from Quraysh. And is this acceptable to all Muslims? That is a really serious debating point that is going to have to be an answer to if the caliphate is going to work. There's also, and I think people underestimate the deep theological problems that a large number of the Shia have with the idea of an elected caliphate. Now, it may be that they'll all be persuaded to change their mind, or it may be that the caliphate will proceed without them. But this is a serious issue. I'm not trying to sort of pour cold water on the idea at all. In fact, I think Jamal's presentation was in lots of ways very inspiring. And I'm not trying to denigrate it. I'm just saying that there are problems there that were not really, as far as I know, people have not really found an acceptable answer to.
Which kindly then leads me on to a question I'd like to pose to Jamal. As Professor Kennedy stated, he is inspired and sympathetic towards the kind of vision you set out in your speech. So 2 very quick points I want to put to you. How do we, again, reconcile these very deep-rooted differences which exist, which Professor Kennedy appears to perceive as obstacles towards the re-establishment of this polity? And secondly, during your address, you kept referring to the Khilafah or the Caliphate as the state. Now, within academic discourse, it has been presented or argued rather that the modern conception of the Islamic State is in fact a kind of, post-colonial, even a Westphalian model sugar-coated in Islamic jargon, a reactionary ideology in response to European colonialism in the region. So 2 points. Again, how do we bridge and reconcile those differences which Professor Kennedy perceives will be problematic to the re-establishment of this polity? And secondly, is the Islamic State, as you put out there, is it really that orthodox and mainstream and normative, or is it just a reactionary conception to European colonialism in the region?
Good points. The first one, and again, yes, there are issues. There's always issues, such a large, diverse region. I'm not trying in any way to downplay the challenge facing Muslims. But Muslims historically are always up for the challenge, and I believe that we are up for this challenge today. But let's take a few quick points. In the recent past, again, prior to, say, 2003, when we saw the Iraq invasion, we did not see a great Shia-Sunni divide, for example, in Iraq. We saw a lot of intermarriage. We saw a lot of, close relations between the various communities, for example, in Iraq. And again, that has been an experience. Professor Fred Halliday even highlighted, he said up until recently, at the time, he said up until recently the experience had not been conflict between Shia and Sunni. I believe that there's been a lot of inflaming of this particular sectarian divide in the more recent years. So as a basis, I don't believe that there's a conflict in that sense that one should be concerned about. Secondly, yes, in terms of people's perspective on Khilafah, Caliphate, Imama, the definition, the structure, these things. Yes, there are some differences, but I don't believe, for example, that the Muslims of Iran who have been suffering under, periods of the Shah of Iran, for example, under secular rule and many other examples in the more recent history, would be averse to seeing an Islamic state emerge in the region. Obviously, we have some issues, for example, this ISIS thing, which is a militia, which is taking upon itself to try and inflame Shia-Sunni matters. And of course, I don't believe ISIS has the legitimacy. They weren't given the bay'ah by the people, they gave it to themselves. And so that we see that there are people or movements trying to inflame divisions, and we should reject that wherever we have it. But there's also another way of looking at this. In addition to just saying that, I don't believe the peoples of the region will be that averse to a new Islamic state, albeit there will be some differences of opinion on its form and function and its adoptions. But also, for example, Imam Khomeini opened the door a little bit with the concept of walayat al-faqih, in the absence of the Imam, that there would be a temporal leadership and authority. So if you look at that, on that concept, that there can be an authority, an Islamic authority, in the absence of their understanding of the coming Imam. So this is also a matter which is also, gives one some hope for positivity again. In relation to your second point, the question of maybe sugarcoating, why is this just a post-colonial? Again, you mentioned the matter of, in the 60s, Arab nationalism, socialism. Yes, people were looking at this colonial period, this immediate colonial period, and into a post-colonial period, looking for solutions. And yes, Islam was not at the top of the agenda amongst many people. It was amongst some, but not amongst maybe the vast majority. I mean, it's debatable, the sort of thing. But the fact of the matter is that we have seen this Islamic revival, which I believe is an intellectual revival in these recent years. If we look back, I've been in this dawah, so to speak, for the last, getting on towards 30 years. And I can remember in the early days, in the 80s, people would say, Caliphate? What are you talking about? Why? And so on and so forth. But I think people have begun to see that they're looking for an Islamic solution. They're looking for Islamic solutions, which naturally brings them back to these Islamic texts. So I would hope that along with this intellectual Islamic revival, in terms of their thoughts, emotions, and feelings, which is based on the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him, that on that basis that they're seeking Islamic solutions to all of the issues that they face, which of course includes this most vital matter of governance. So in terms of seeking Islamic governance, they want to say, what is that pristine example of Islamic ruling that would be so appropriate for all? And again, the last point I'll say, maybe marrying these 2 points together, is that, as I said in my brief presentation, that we would like to believe that this next caliphate, which returns, will be a haven for citizens of all shapes, colors, sizes, beliefs, because that was how it was in the early days. And from the Sunnah of the Prophet, there was encouragement from peoples of all areas and regions. There was no compulsion in terms of the belief, but there was a solid, stable rule of law, which I think people could live by, and they could prosper.
So, in terms of this optimistic vision which Jamal has set out, and from your studies within the different dynasties and or the history of the Caliphate in the region, the dominant narrative at the moment from the media, from policymakers, in light of the war on terror, is that there really isn't any space or room for such a polity or institution in today's modern era of nation state, and that a caliphate, however mainstream or normative it may be within Islamic theology, is ultimately a barbaric, medieval, illiberal, backward, expansionist state. Do you see problems with this if it was to manifest in today's world? How do you think a modern caliphate would respond to its neighbors and other superpowers of the time?
Well, I disagree with your idea that it's a reactionary and barbaric idea. I mean, I think just as Jamal was saying, that the record of the Caliphate, particularly under the Umayyads and the Abbasids in the early centuries, and in their different way, the Fatimids of Egypt, the record of Caliphate tended to be one of social inclusion, and it tended to be one of encouraging economic development. That doesn't mean there weren't terrible things going on. Remember, with the first 4 caliphs of Islam, 3 of them were killed by other Muslims. Right from the beginning, there were very strong different points of view. So I don't think that, and I think that's absolutely right. The idea of the nation state has been a disaster in the Middle East. I mean, as a historian, you can't but look back with sadness about the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, to be honest. When people in the whole of the Fertile Crescent area lived together and rubbed shoulders together, despite religions and ethnic and financial and economic in a way that seems unattainable nowadays. So I'm not for a moment. I don't think that the call for the caliphate is a reactionary or barbaric. It is at all. I think it's a difficult thing, but that's something different from saying that it's reactionary or barbaric, or that it's out to conquer the world. So if we look at the model that is provided by the great caliphates of the past, we will see a broadly based society, a society in the Abbasid period particularly, and the Umayyad period and the Fatimids, that is alive to the possibility of new ideas coming from wherever they come. If they're good new ideas, we'll adopt them. Look at the way the Abbasid society took on board the idea of what we now call Arabic numbers, which are essentially Indian numbers and so on. A major advance in the way human beings basically do their adding up and everything that follows from that. Or the way in which, again, in the Abbasid Caliphate, the invention of paper or the bringing of paper transforms literacy and the way that books and the written word are produced. The record of the ancient caliphates is one of openness to new ideas, of adaptability, of all sorts of progressive and sometimes not progressive, to be honest, but in many ways progressive economic policies and so on. And that's the sort of vision that I think is helpful and inspiring. And but we should also be, well, I don't want to go harp on this too much, but the issues of division are very real ones. The problem, well, it's not a problem, but when we start to talk about caliphate as opposed to mulk or just monarchy or a presidential system, is that we have to start talking about the relationship of the caliph, not just with the people, but the relationship of the caliph with God. And when we start doing that, then we get into very sensitive territory. And different groups of Muslims, again, have very different views about the relationship of the caliph with Almighty God. And that's an issue that is Muslims have been debating for the last 1,500 years and will go on debating, I'm sure, into the future.
So obviously, from your extensive research and study into the different caliphates which existed, the Rashidun, the Umayyad, the Abbasids, the Ottomans, would you regard any of these as authoritarian or very centralized?
Not in the modern sense, because pre-modern states don't have the weapons of centralization and enforcement. I mean, all the caliphates tended to be exactly what Jamal was, a sort of, as long as you obey the law, there's a live and let live attitude to it. Different sorts of communities can coexist. And Sir Thomas Arnold, as the quote, Thomas Arnold actually was the first predecessor of mine as Professor Arabic at SOAS. I have a certain feeling for him. But Sir Thomas Arnold's comment about enforcement of ideological conformity was very, very rare. And the issue of the createdness of the Quran and the time of the Caliph al-Ma'mun that again Jamal was talking about was a very rare example when a caliph, for whatever reason, attempted to lay down the law about a complex and difficult theological issue. And it was a disaster. Nobody, or most people, did not accept the right of the caliph to make a decision about this, as I say, very complex, actually rather rarefied issue about the createdness of the Quran, which I could talk about at more length, but I think we need, but not just now, perhaps.
I mean, it is very heartwarming and somewhat promising to see that, you know, Professor Kennedy has a very, like yourself, Jamal, a very optimistic understanding of the Caliphate, its viability, but perhaps more from a historical academic perspective. But let's talk about political realities. The political reality is post 9/11, war on terror. It has become somewhat mainstream that the Caliphate is a backward, barbaric, illiberal entity which Islamists are trying to revive for global domination, right? And your address, you set out this kind of exemplary vision of how it would be the solution for the region. Some may call it a utopian vision, some may call it an unrealistic vision. Wouldn't a more practical reality be a kind of Islamic EU, a kind of more Islamic federation kind of thing, which may well exist, which is more plausible, more practical? And if it did, how would it deal with other superpowers and the rest of the world?
Yes, I mean, Hugh has made some very good points there, and again, just reiterating, if we look at this tapestry of the Islamic history under the Caliphate, and not trying to put roses on everything, we can learn a lot from the very good caliphs, and we can also a lot from the very bad ones, because there were quite a number of bad ones. You mentioned hereditary and so on, some of these issues. So we know many of those mistakes that were done. But of course, we don't take, as Muslims, we don't take our position from history. Obviously, as Muslims, we have an usul, we have a foundation, which is the Quran and the Sunnah. And of course, which should derive from that, the Ijma, Sahaba, and Qiyas. So this is the foundation upon which I'm presenting ideas this evening. Obviously, there are some slight variations with some other schools of thought. But upon this basis is how one builds the argument or the presentation in terms of how this state will look. And that's obviously within that remit, within that objective, that is what we would mean by the term caliphate and how that is going to be functioning moving forward. So the notion of a European Union, a federation of states, a loose affiliation. We've seen many examples of this. We've seen Arab League, for example. We've seen, Muslim League. We've seen other attempts at this. And of course, they've probably not surprisingly failed because there was no real foundation there between them. Because whilst we have great respect for the Arabic language, the language of the Quran, that this is not a basis for unity of a language itself. Islam is a basis of unity as a belief, as an ideology, but it's not the language which is the defining characteristics. It is Islam itself, which is the key element. So when we look at this in terms of the Quran and the Sunnah, there can only be one caliph. There can only be one imam. There cannot be 2, 3, 4. If there's a second, very graphically strike his neck, as the hadith said, which means that there can only be one head of state. Again, we put forward that the caliphate is the temporal leadership of Muslims on the earth, a head of state who will rule in accordance with the Sharia and will be accountable to all of the citizens of that state. So that is in accordance with the Sharia. The Sharia will be in accordance with the Quran and Sunnah. So the question of unity of the Muslims, whilst it makes a lot of great sense, I mean, some people maybe highlighted that I talk about economics maybe more than I should, but again, from an economic reality, it's crazy to divide your land up into tiny little pieces and then to give all the oil into these sort of these sheikdoms and families and whatever else in the Gulf states. I mean, that's crazy. Of course, we can't have that. But from an Islamic perspective, there should not be borders which are imposed by Messrs. Sykes and Picot, as an example, which sadly is still the reality in much of our lands.
Okay, you can have that mic. I've got my own now. So look, stability in the region, right? Especially in the age of modern warfare, nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction. How would this caliphate that you envisage actually deal with stability in the region? Surely a caliphate, as per the one you describe, would actually be more problematic if it got its hands on, let's say, nuclear weapons, because then you'd have essentially a state which would be capable of fighting back those foreign interventions, be it economical, be it political, be it military. Can you not see that as a problem? Isn't stability?
Yeah, I mean, stability, absolutely. I mean, this is really what the people are looking for. But what do we mean by stability? Most people, the requirements, myself included, are very simple and basic. I would like to have somewhere where I feel secure. So security is absolutely important. I want to have some security, not just for myself, but for my family, in terms of food supply and in terms of housing and these basic requirements. But security is much wider. I don't want to live in a land which is constantly beset with war, where other powers are maybe coming because I have a lot of oil and it's a great resource to have influence and control over, for example. I don't want to have a scenario where the leaders and the elites in the society are monopolizing all of that wealth. Particularly if my belief system tells me that wealth, in particular, the oil, the gas, the minerals, and so on, is a public resource, and that public resource should be the property of the people, as the Hadith mentioned. The people are partners in three: the fire, the water, the herbage. The fire includes this, the oil, the gas, the minerals. So to have those types of things, I can see that's going to cause great frustration, because then as an adjunct to that, this unnatural monopolizing of wealth will lead to poverty, will lead to insecurity, will lead to war, will lead to all of these other undesirables. So I see Islam as a solution to these matters in terms of providing that stability. I mean, you touched on poverty as well. I mean, zakat is a very good example. 2.5% of wealth which is not actively used, in addition to some of the livestock and so on, and the inventories. That's an incredible resource of wealth, of which the 8 categories includes the poor, the destitute, at the top of the list. So that, in historic terms, the types of poverty, the swinging poverty that we see, for example, in Africa, North Africa, South Africa, in many parts in between, and South Asia and so on and so forth, were not a reality of the past. This is a great sadness to us all that we can see these great disparities. These are the sources of insecurity. These are the lack of stability that we are facing today. Not just the wars which are sadly happening. So in these matters, I see Islam as a solution to these problems, and I would definitely see the Caliphate leading the way. And the last point I mentioned is, you mentioned, what about weapons of mass destruction and so on and so forth. Islamic law with regards to jihad is very, very detailed and very restrictive, I might add. Do not kill people of faith. Do not kill women and children. Do not even destroy the forests. Do not destroy the infrastructure and all of these things. So you're getting far, far away from the nightmare of the nuclear weapons. Now, I accept that nuclear weapons exist and that we have an element of mutually assured destruction. Surprise, surprise, it's called MAD. But the point there being that you don't have to have nuclear weapons to be used. And I know, for example, Pakistan has nuclear weapons. Does not mean they're going to be used in an Islamic state. The point is that it is an element of defense in terms of having weapons. It does not mean that those weapons are going to be used. So there's a careful point that I'll make there.
Okay. Professor Kennedy, minority treatment within the caliphates, be it the Shia, the Ismailis, the Druze, the Armenians, the Alawites, how do you kind of grade the treatment of minorities under the caliphate, historically speaking? And can you actually see, realistically, if a caliphate was to ever re-emerge in today's world, religious-based taxes like the jizya, where taxes are based upon religious identity, so two questions: minority treatment under caliphate, and can you see a taxation system based on religion or religious identity?
Yes, I think most of those things are interesting points. The question of treatment of minorities, of course, varies enormously. And the point that Jamal was making about tension between Sunnis and Shiis, there have been times in Islamic history when this has been a very, very real issue. In Baghdad, it may seem a long time ago, around the year 1000, you'll be surprised to know, the city of Baghdad was devastated by wars between Sunnis and Shiis. The whole city was divided into different quarters, belonging into different groups, and they hated each other, and they killed each other. So what's new? But the point I think is worth making is, in the long centuries between the year 1000 and the year 2000, this was not a problem in Baghdad or anywhere else. The different communities, just as you're describing, lived together. There are certain times of tension and anxiety when relations between different communities and between the governing class and the minorities become very difficult. There is also, I think, a realistic perception. We see this in examples like Al-Andalus, of different communities living together, that there is a hierarchy of communities. And if the, as it were, the dominant community, be it Sunni or Shia or whatever, feels secure, then minority communities can exist and have. But if the dominant community feels challenged by minorities for whatever reason, then intercommunal tensions become very apparent. So things change at different times and in different places. The question of taxation according to religion, the jizya as a tax that non-Muslims pay. But of course, non-Muslims don't pay a sadaqah. They don't pay a zakat. And there's been very interesting recent research about the early Islamic period in Egypt. And Egypt is very interesting because we get a lot of papyrus documents that actually talk about everyday life as it really was, rather than what the lawyers say it should have been and what the historians say it was, and so on. Everyday life as it really was. And they seem to show that the rate of taxation was not much difference between Dhimmis and Muslims. It was just called different things. For the Dhimmis it was called a jizya, for the Muslims it was called a sadaqah, but they were both taxes, they were both extracted by the government. And so perhaps this, if you look at the law, this seems to be a big issue, but perhaps in the way that it panned out in reality, it wasn't such a key difference.
Jamal, minority treatment within the caliphate. We hear, alleged horror stories of the Armenian massacre, the treatment of Alawites, the treatment of other minorities. Heck, let's take it all the way back to the time of the Prophet, Banu Qurayza, a number of Jewish tribes that were exiled from Medina. Perhaps is this acceptable in the modern day where things have moved on?
Yeah, no, let me get to that point, but I'll just echo this point on the jizya. I mean, there was again, doing a bit of research for this talk, Gustave Le Bon, in his book, The Civilization of the Arabs, he said, and I quote, he said, "So they treated the people of Syria, Egypt, Spain, and every country they took over with great kindness, as we have seen. They left their laws, regulations, and beliefs intact, and only imposed on them the jizya, which was paltry when compared to what they had been paying in taxes previously, in exchange for maintaining their security. The truth is that nations had never known conquerors more tolerant than the Muslims or a religion more tolerant than Islam." There's many other quotes one could come to. I mean, I'm not a historian. We can leave that to Professor Kennedy for his wise words. But yes, the point is that we can look through periods of history and we can look at the black spots and we can see obviously misapplications and we can see in general the absence of Islam in these matters. Whereas I mentioned, the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ when he said that whoever harms a dhimmi harms me, meaning that the concept of citizenship in Islam is very, very strong. So much so that the Caliph has a responsibility to the citizens. Behold, the Imam is a guardian, right? So the point is he has a responsibility to the citizens, which is greater than his responsibility to Muslims that are living outside of an Islamic state. So if there's a caliphate today and there was a caliph there, he is responsible and indeed accountable to every citizen from whichever belief or no belief that they have within that state, and will be accounted through an institution, for example, by the Mahkamat al-Madhalim or the Court of the Acts of Injustice, who will scrutinize his behavior, because nobody is above the law. This is the reality of the Sharia. Okay, we've seen examples where some caliphs or others, acted like as though they were above the law, but the reality is that the Sharia says nobody is above the law. Allah, Muhammad said he would, even if Fatima, the daughter of Muhammad, stole, he would cut her hand. So the point is nobody's family, no person is above the law, and that everyone in a position of authority would be accountable to the Court of the Acts of Injustice. Again, this is why it's so important to have an independent judiciary, because that judiciary can examine up to and including the Caliph, and up to and including removing the Caliph from office if he does not uphold his contract, which is to implement Islam. So if he's not implementing Islam, he can be withheld. So all of these questions of persecution of minorities and those things are absolutely forbidden in Islam. So we have to look at incidences that within this particular framework to say that, if we see misapplications of Islam, we can see that what Islam says about that matter and say that, this is absolutely not. Because, and indeed we have to be upfront with everybody about this, because the law in Islam is a law. There's some debate about aspects of it, but even amongst all of these main schools, there is an incredible agreement in terms of these main points. So the treatment of minorities is of great importance in Islam, and I believe is why we saw such a burgeoning of the people embracing Islam and indeed supporting Islam when it spread throughout as far as North Africa, as far as Asia and China. That the reason of that spread was so successful was because of this treatment of people. It was not to come dominate people and just extract taxes from them, which was their history and reality previously.
So just to conclude on two questions to each of you with regards to your respective areas of expertise before we open the floor up to the audience. Professor Kennedy, again, you've studied numerous caliphates, numerous dynasties, the good, the bad, the ugly. And modernity is one thing which is kind of subjective and relevant to its respective era. Am I correct? So what's deemed modernity now is certainly not necessarily what was considered modernity, let's say 100 or 150 years ago. Yeah. So in this regard, can you foresee a caliphate in the 21st century that may well have the trappings of any successful modern state?
Yes, it would need to have this in terms of using communications and things like that. It would need to have and simply the maintenance of law and order, so people can drive along the road from A to B without putting their lives at risk. I mean, all these trappings of the modern state, a new caliphate would have to have, because that's what people demand and expect from a viable state. A modern caliphate would probably have to insist that people wore seatbelts in their cars when they were driving. Now, that's a sort of, that seems like a trivial example, but actually it isn't, because it's about the state, a khalifa taking measures, enforcing laws which are actually for the benefit of everybody. And those sorts of trappings of the modern state would have to be part of the Khilafah.
Okay. Jamal, in terms of socio-political economic solution for the region, is it an all or nothing case with you? Is it a case that we have a caliphate or it's all doom and gloom for the region? Is there a middle ground? Is it an all or nothing position for you? And if so, why is that the case?
Well, I believe as Muslims, our belief is kind of all or nothing. It's not like we're a part Muslim. We believe in one part of Islam and disbelieve in another. So we fast. Ramadan, alhamdulillah, is coming soon. We pray. We perform the Hajj if we can afford it. We the means. We have a basis of our belief. This principle, when we look in the Quran, such a large part of the Quran deals with societal matters. It's not just individual matters. Yes, there's many individual matters, the relationship between the human being and his creator, the relationship between yourself and your family, and the relationship yourself, how you carry yourself, your food you eat, and all of these types of matters. But so much of it is the societal. So Muslims will not, close themselves away from that. And when we see such serious issues and problems in our world today, it brings us back to this burning imperative to see the change. And, people came on the streets in the Middle East in recent years. We want to see a change of the system. In the face of, some of the most appalling threats against their life and limb from mukhabarat and snipers and this and that, they came out on the streets and said, we want to see change. So we cannot abandon that. And this is why I don't think it's fair to say that there's some sort of halfway thing, because the halfway thing we've seen for all of these years. We're not halfway Muslims. We want to be complete Muslims, which means that we don't want to take a small part of the Quran, when we're reciting the Quran this Ramadan, and say, wait, stop, we've gone through 30% of it now, let's just leave all the rest of it. It's not relevant for us. No, we can't do that. We are here and looking to solve the problems, and this is really the way that we need to be looking at this.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for that session of discussion. I'll now open the floor up for questions from the audience. I kindly request that we don't have khutbahs or long speeches, that they do remain as questions. So I'll open the floor up, and the gentleman at the front.
Thanks very much. I've got a couple of questions, quick ones if that's possible. First of all, to Jamal, on the economics, there are sovereign wealth funds now. I know sovereign wealth funds are supposed to be for the people, all right? They may not be working as such, but they are supposed to be for the people. So why does one have to go to a caliphate in order to distribute that wealth to the people if you've got the sovereign wealth fund? It works in Norway, for example. Second point is, there's 6 million Jews in Israel. What happens to Israel under the Caliphate? And how far does the Middle East spread? Does the Middle East go to Turkey, for example?
Or beyond Turkey even, to the doors of Europe, like it once did, eh, Jamal?
Yes, in terms of sovereign wealth funds, yes, there's various investment structures that states have, modern states have, and a modern caliphate. Again, the points that Hugh made, I think, are very good. And right from the earliest days, we saw, that in the Uthmani times, adopting, a man after my own heart as an accountant. I'm not ashamed to say that as an accountant, many might be, but adopted the diwan system from the Persians in the very early days of the Caliphate, which means that in technological matters, in some of these matters which were not related to the core rules and laws in terms of the Islamic technological matters, and again, as Hugh rightly highlighted, in the Abbasid period, for example, we saw many great advancements in terms of technology and science because Islam is very neutral on these matters. It actually has a great encouragement for the study of science and for the study of that which can be of technology, with accounting, all of these sciences you might loosely describe, or the arts as well includes many of these topics. There's a great encouragement of that. Similarly, in terms of investment, there are rules about investment and non-investment and what have you. But the biggest issue I have with sovereign wealth funds is that it's within this nation-state structure, which means that it's all well and good for Kuwait to have massive sovereign wealth funds, but it's not being shared around. What have we been seeing in terms of Somalia, in terms of recent months, in terms of famine? That is shameful that we would have an aggregation of wealth in one area and just across the pond, the people are starving and they don't have the food, to meet. So the vehicle itself is not the problem, although I would also add a caveat that some of those vehicles are invested into interest and things that Islam does not allow. But the notion of actually wealth being available in certain structures is not alien to Islam, obviously within halal, but the problem we have is that this nation state is providing chains around which these wealth funds are being held. About Israel. Again, the history of Jews, Christians, people of no faith in the Islamic State is very well known. When Ferdinand and Isabella were doing their, Spanish Inquisition, forced conversion, or we're going to kill you, Sultan Bayezid II accepted them with open arms. And he said, how could this man be called Ferdinand the Wise when he has enriched our lands with these people? Meaning that there is basically an open encouragement for people of all faiths within the Caliphate. That's the base position. However, when the land has been, we believe, unjustly usurped, when the authority has been taken, and when the people are being forced to live into what I would describe, others have, and maybe even used worse terminology, like an apartheid system, whereby there's a second-class citizenship and their land has been taken, whether that is their towns or their villages or other things. That is a problem that needs to be resolved. Now, in future, in terms of this, I believe that in future that this region will come back to Islam. I don't know when. But in future, I believe that there will be Jews and Christians and others living there side by side with Muslims. But it will not be under the authority of a secular, apartheid, state type structure that we see today. I would believe that it would be a fair, just caliphal system there today. Your last point about Turkey, yes, Turkey was clearly a part of the Islamic State. So again, I would see that, the topic tonight, I was invited to talk about Caliphate for the Middle East. I believe that, that Caliphate may return. It may return in Turkey. It was the seat of the Ottoman state. It may return in Pakistan. There's a very large number of Muslims seeking change in Pakistan. So I think we've got to be open-minded to the question of saying Muslims seeking change, because I believe that this Islamic revival which is happening, many parts of the world, maybe different strengths, Uzbekistan, South Asia, many different parts of Indonesia, many different parts of the Muslim world, we can see these signs of change. So when, where, I can't say, unification of those lands, yes, I believe it will happen. Again, over what time frames, I couldn't speculate. But yes, I would certainly look at Turkey as coming back, and I believe that the people of Turkey would be happy for this.
Okay, so we'll take a question from social media. Professor Kennedy, Abu Ibrahim asked that Theresa May said, if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. Was there or is there such a concept of citizenship, historically speaking?
Blimey. I am no admirer of Theresa May, and I have all sorts of issues with her as regards the politics, and I, I would like to see myself as a citizen of the world. I think that comment that she made was destructive and prejudiced. I don't really know what more to say about that, actually. I think that it's, and I'm not sure that it really helps us with the understanding of the Caliphate either. But
okay, so let me kind of switch up a bit. The conception of citizenship, historically speaking, was it something that was valued, safeguarded, upheld, preserved throughout the time?
The question of citizenship, it doesn't really occur in that way. People are all citizens because they are servants of God. And that primarily, and we should never lose touch of this, was their primary loyalty was not to the state or even to the caliph. Their primary loyalty was to God. And that's how people saw themselves in pre-modern times. They would say that they were ruled by X or Y, or, and very occasionally there would be a religious revival grouping that would catch people's loyalties and so on. But by and large, I'm sorry, I'm really sort of wandering around about this story, this answer a bit, because I'm not quite sure how to frame it. But people respected authority. There's a very strong tradition in Islamic thought that you shouldn't, because if you rebel against authority, you get into fitna, you get into destruction, and all sorts of terrible things can happen, as we've been seeing all sorts of terrible things happening in Syria and so on. So there's a strong tradition. It's not the only tradition, of course, in Islam, but one of the traditions in Islamic political thought is you accept the authority that there is. You could try to change it, but you don't rebel against it, because that way it leads to disaster. So that is a sort of citizenship, I suppose.
That's actually
not a very good answer. I'm sorry.
No, but it's a very important one that you raised, which kind of then leads me, I'm sorry to be very selfish. Jamal, and I kindly request that you keep the responses as short as possible. The idea of rebelling, anarchy, is this a legitimate method that you foresee in today's era to reestablish the caliphate? I mean, some would regard the Arab Spring as a form of rebellion against existing status quo, existing security. Do you think this is a viable or Islamic method to bring change?
We have to be very clear in terms of this terminology, rebelling, anarchy, and so on. There is an Islamic methodology for change. That methodology, again, as very clearly set out by Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was that it would be a political change. So the notion of civil war, for example, or anarchy, as being a solution before something else comes in its stead, or that there would be a class struggle, or there's been various theories which people put forward in terms of change, or indeed, just fight the regime, or this type of thing. No, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, challenged the system, challenged it intellectually, challenged it politically. So we believe the change that must come in our lands is an intellectual, political challenge. So, وَلْتَكُمْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٍ, there should be a group, calling to khair, calling to Islam, commanding maruf, forbidding munkar. Surah Al-Imran says this. So it says that there should be a group or groups, political in nature, which are changing the system. So that really is a methodology for change. It is not one for open war, for terror, for anarchy, or all these other notions.
Audience members, the brother in the back there.
Question was regarding the sectarian divide. You said with amongst the Muslim ranks, there's so many different views. With the upcoming elections, we also have you have the the Conservative, Labour, you have UKIP. Now, as Muslims, if they can all get along with the same objective, if the Muslims have that same fundamental objective of being under Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's law, can we all get along? Or are we saying there's different doctrines amongst the Muslims?
And who is that question to? Okay. So I believe the gentleman, he basically posed that, we've got different political parties in this country, in the Western world. They appear to be very different in terms of their manifestos, etc. But they seem to kind of get along and coexist as part of the same system. Would that be a kind of realistic thing with the different, juristic differences, creedal differences? Jamal?
Yeah, no, I think it's a fair analogy. Meaning that a difference of opinion in terms of one school of thought is not a basis for conflict in itself, as I gave the example post-2003, in which there was inflaming of sectarian divisions, or the ISIS situation where there's a clear targeting, for example, of Shia. So these matters, if we remove that type of catalyst, which is a disaster, then we don't have a fundamental basis for division and conflict. Again, although Hugh did also highlight some back in history as well. So we should look at it from that perspective in terms of actually, there's a lot which unifies these Muslims, and in terms of seeking the change that we have, we believe it's going to come somewhere in this area. And I believe many of the other Muslims will get involved when they see the fairness of that.
Professor Kennedy, Saeed asked on social media, was the Caliphate ever an isolationist state historically? So was ever a time, historically speaking, the Abbasids or the Umayyads or the Ottomans or the Rashidun were like the North Korea of their time?
No, but can I just add a little thing to what Jamal has been saying in the response to the last question? I think one of the things that has been down, I'm not, going to tell Muslims what they should, but it's this whole doctrine of takfir, which has crept in. The idea that Muslims who do not believe the same things as you are not proper Muslims. I think this is an idea that actually goes right back to the time of the Kharijites in early Islam, but it's an idea that has been revived, and it seems to me to be a very destructive idea in terms of how the Caliphate could be negotiated. Isolationist? No, not at all. There was a period in the time of the Umayyads and the Abbasids when certainly the caliphs didn't interact, but that's mostly because the people on their borders were either so scattered, like the people of the Sahara, or so poor, like the people of Western Europe, that there wasn't really very much interaction to be done. There was nothing against interaction. It was just that the Muslim world in the time of say Harun al-Rashid and around the year 800 was so vast and all-encompassing that they weren't that there wasn't much else to relate to. But remember, even in the time of Harun al-Rashid, the Emperor Charlemagne sent a mission to examine the churches in Jerusalem and see if he could offer the churches in Jerusalem some help with their buildings and so on. And there was no record of being any challenge to that.
So no, historically speaking, no North Koreas, no?
No.
Okay.
No. It's sort of inconceivable somehow. It's
Okay.
not the way it works.
Sister, the back there.
Okay, this is a question to Professor Kennedy.
Sorry, I'll have to come up then. I'm slightly deaf.
Shut up.
Okay, would you support the implementation of the Caliphate and would you live under it?
So would you live under a caliphate, Professor Kennedy?
I wouldn't have no objection, providing it was the sort of caliphate that Jamal has been describing. I think different people come from different traditions. I obviously come from a Christian tradition. I come from a Christian tradition because my father's father's fathers and my mother's mother's mothers, right back to, as far as we can tell, come from that Christian tradition. And so I would feel more comfortable perhaps in under a Christian rulership. But as I said, the sort of broad-minded and caliphate that Jamal has been describing, I think would be very interesting.
Question here.
Question to both, really. The Caliphate obviously has a deep history of over 1,000 years, and it's a social political model that was implemented in the Muslim world. Now in the 21st century, especially in the West, we're seeing so many problems in terms of the political upheaval that we're seeing in America, in Europe at the moment, the rise of the far right. We're seeing economic disparity, the wealthy are getting more wealthier and the poor are getting more poorer. We're seeing many problems. So Professor Kennedy, from your point of view, can the Khilafah in the 21st century provide modern solutions to the problems of the West? Can it inspire the West to solve some of their problems that we are seeing in the West itself? Because we're clearly seeing liberal democracies are really struggling in solving some of the problems. And again, same question goes to Jamal.
Yeah, this is a political question rather than a historian's question, isn't it? I personally believe that liberal democracy is much stronger and more resilient. I think there are times of turbulence, like there are on a bad flight over the mountains or something. There are times of turbulence, but liberal democracy is resilient. And we've seen the kickback against the rise of the right in France and so on. I think that there have always been times of difficulty. The 20th century was a terrible century for liberal democracy, or the first half of the 20th century was a terrible time for liberal democracy in Western Europe, and in fact, terrible time for everybody in Western Europe. There are periods in history when there is turbulence, and I think different areas of the world have their own traditions of dealing with this sort of turbulence. In Muslim societies, Khilafah is a traditional way of doing it. In Northwest Europe, we have different ways of dealing with it. I don't know. As I say, it's a political question, not a historical question. I don't really want to get involved in.
Okay, so before I do pose the same question to Jamal, historically speaking, then, was there ever a time where the Islamic civilization provided, contemporary solutions that were borrowed by the Christian world, adopted by the Christian world to enhance their standard of living? Wasn't the Renaissance all about that?
Sorry?
Wasn't the Renaissance about borrowing from the East and reviving?
There are certainly borrowings, but for cultural reasons they wouldn't normally be acknowledged, if you see what I mean. Certainly technologies. I mean, the two that I suggested earlier, like that the Arabic numerals and the making of paper are both technologies that are developed in many ways in the Middle East and then eagerly adopted by first people in the Mediterranean, in Italy and so on, and then in the whole of Western Europe. So there was no objection to doing that sort of thing.
Jamal, is there anything, a caliphate or an Islamic government, one that you envisage can provide some solutions for the West?
Yeah, no, I mean, many. I mean, I'll just give a couple of very quick examples. I mean, after 2008 with the financial crisis, I was fortunate to be involved in writing a paper talking about the root causes of that, this gambling culture and the growth of derivatives, and how that related to the Islamic Sharia laws, and in terms of that particular crisis, which was a systemic crisis and was a global crisis. I mean, starting in North America and Western Europe, and to which we're still suffering to an extent. I mean, many commentators at that time looked at Islamic banking and other things and said, oh, gee, they haven't had the same issue. But we went a little bit, said that, it is actually quite a deep issue there. The second one, again, I think over in terms of the growth of the far right, we have this issue here over the concept of immigration, or a perceived problem of immigration. The reality is that, sadly, some politicians are using this, whereas there tends to be an ebb and flow of immigrants into the country, depending on some economic realities of the need for immigration versus, when the economy turns down, it's like, oh, we don't like these immigrants and we want somebody to blame, and so on. It's very unfair. Yeah, very unfair. So I would say that the open inclusiveness notion of citizenship, which Islam encourages, and again, let's be frank about this. If you look around the world, countries which have larger, more density in terms of populations tend to be more prosperous. So it's not the numbers that counts. It's actually politicians and others trying to inflame division against people who maybe come from a different background or different race or different belief. And I think this is really where Islam said, no, we're going to take a completely open view about everybody's belief and background and country and everything else. let's get on with it. And it's just rule of law, respect for, not even belief in the rule of law, but respect for the belief of law.
Any questions from the audience? The sister on the left.
I want to ask Jamal how does the caliphate exist within the reality of modern states? So will it accept the kind of regions that are given at the moment, or will it like rule part of nation states? And also like Kennedy's opinion on that. Would a modern caliphate have to accept modern states?
So if I understood correctly and heard correctly, the sister asked, would a modern caliphate accept modern states?
Yeah, like existing states.
Existing nation states. Okay. Jamal.
You mean in the Muslim world or in the non-Muslim world?
So a caliphate becomes in the future, would it have to accept the existing nation states when it rules? So would it rule like part of Pakistan, or will it rule the whole of Pakistan?
Well, the base position is that it will seek the reunification of those Muslim lands. So the lands which were part of the Caliphate previously would seek to see a unification with that. Again, I don't know over what time that would happen, but I would hope that it would come, quickly. In terms of understanding the rest of the world, so then yes, there's an implicit recognition that there is other lands, whether that's the US, whether that's Britain, whether that's Russia, and so on and so so on and so forth. And again, like any state on the global stage, there is relationships. There may be trade relationships. There may be diplomatic agreements, and so on and so forth. And all of those trappings of modern statehood. For example, the having diplomatic offices, there would be that type of situation. Involvement in international conferences and possibly some international bodies. I doubt that there would be involvement in the United Nations, for example, because it has a certain basis of its understanding of law, which would be in disagreement. But that doesn't mean that there would not be other bodies which a new caliphate would not be a member of, and who would be seeking to, the caliphate is an ideological state, which means that it does carry ideas and wants to carry those ideas to the world. So these sorts of diplomatic channels are very, very important. Trade, diplomatic, and so on. Educational, all of these, environmental. There's many bases upon which the modern day caliphate, if we want to use that word, will be interacting.
Professor Kennedy, based on that, let me ask you, what Jamal describes as the Islamic unification of these lands may well be perceived as an expansionist agenda and annexing sovereign states from a nation state perspective. Can you see how this could be problematic?
I can see how this can be problematic from a nation-state point of view. I mean, if we get to what Jamal was calling the Westphalian, or you were calling, I think, the Westphalian point of view, the nation-state is, so to speak, sacred and inviolable. I think the nation-state has served the Middle East very poorly as a concept. And I think there is lots of good reasons for suggesting that another model should be should be tried at least, or at least, in another model has possibilities for all the reasons that Jamal is saying about the artificiality of the boundaries and the enormous discrepancies in wealth and so on that see it's something I feel very strongly about. Just at this precise moment, one of the richest states in the world, the Saudi state, is bombing to destruction one of the poorest states in the Yemen, and I think that's a terrible tragedy, and that exactly illustrates the problems that we've got.
So I'll take two more questions from the floor. This is on the left there in the front.
Question for Jamal. How would you envisage deposing, for instance, the King of Morocco, King of Saudi Arabia, because under Islam it's not allowed? So
I think this brings back the question of rebellion again.
For many years, it's a very thank you. It's a very good question, and the point is that for so many years we've seen people say, "Gee, why don't we come back to a caliphate and this and that?" And then everyone would say, "Oh, wait a second, can't imagine that. There's a border there, and there's a kingdom there, and there's this, and there's an emperor, and there's this guy that sitting up in his palace, and you can't even imagine anything changing." But really we saw this Arab Spring. As I say, I'm not saying it was a solution of everything, but it did indicate that there was a strong motivation amongst peoples to see that we want to see change. Now to an extent, some of that's been hijacked. We've seen hijackings of that or dissipations of that, but I believe that the flow, the tide of this revival is happening. So ultimately, a dictator, a despot, a tyrant, a king, a this or that, whatever, cannot be sustainable if the public really are not, with it, right? So the question is, the public opinion is rising for Caliphate. The public opinion is rising for change. So I believe these people are on borrowed time, ultimately. So I think at some point they will be arrested. They will be tried for their injustices. And I believe that's very important because Islam, what happened to Gaddafi and all this stuff, this is not correct. And people should be tried for crimes that they have done. And again, I think many of those are responsible for crimes.
Before I take the final question from the audience, just to add to that point, look, there seems to be a contemporary narrative that the flag bearers, the supporters, the callers of a modern caliphate are in fact of a khariji mentality, that they want to rebel against the rulers, they're anarchists. So the very thing which Professor Kennedy condemned as takfir or as a problem for the establishment of this institution, why has that label of being a khawarij been attributed to certain movements? I would even go as far as to say many Islamic political movements have been tarnished as takfiris or khawarij.
No, I'm not trying to dodge it, and I agree that a takfiri approach is wholly inappropriate. This is a question of if we start going around labeling this guy is and this guy is not Muslim and everything, it's a recipe for disaster, and it's not the way that we should be approaching. But the other dark side of this is that any elements of division that we do have, this guy's a Wahhabi, this guy's this guy's that, is also not right, because the putting divisions between Muslims, this sort of old divide and rule scenario comes into it, meaning that it's much easier for an outside power to control a country, a region, if the people are beset with internal divisions. So we need to man up and rise up and think and say that, yes, there is some differences that we have, but within the shade of a respectful authority which does not interfere into people's beliefs, we can sit and have some of these debates and actually talk about some of these differences of opinions within that. But the basics are not being done. The providing the food, the shelter, the protection, the security, the ending of these pointless wars, like the Saudi, the Yemeni, the conflict, this is what we've got to be focusing on. And that needs a new approach to the authority that we have in our lands. And this is why Caliphate, has got to be at the top of our agenda.
Final question from the brother in the front here.
A question to both the speakers. Wouldn't you agree that it's slightly problematic and perhaps more modern utopian view that the Islamic Caliphate is something that only existed during the Caliphate of Rashidun, and that it didn't really exist for a period much longer, where actually I would the history and the kind of plan for the Caliphate is something that's quite grand. I mean, the Caliphate existed up until 90 or so years ago, or 100 if we're talking about a more pure version of the Caliphate. So wouldn't we say actually the plans for how the economy should operate, how social affairs should be managed, how the government should be organized, although having its basis, of course, in front of the Prophet Muhammad and the laws that were brought down by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, wouldn't you say that these are already have been developed, they're just being neglected? Because actually the Caliphate isn't some kind of utopian vision.
You're entering lecture mode, brother. Okay. So if I understood correctly, the brother asked this grand project for the re-establishment or the viability of the caliphate in the region. Is this something we have to start from scratch, or are there existing foundations and examples which we can take and which would be applicable? Am I correct? Yeah, it's not something we need to start from scratch. It's something that's existed. Professor Kennedy.
Well, Muslims throughout history have I mean, there was a strong point of view, I think, held by Ibn Khaldun and probably Ibn Taymiyyah as well. I may have got this wrong. That the only real caliphate was the Caliphate of the Rashidun, and afterwards things were. There are other people who say the caliphate ended with the fall of the conquest of Baghdad by the Mongols in 1258, and that later caliphates were not sort of and so on. I think you have to look back to the whole caliphal experience, shall we say, put it that way. The different ways caliphates and different people have about different caliphates. And as Jamal was saying again, that there were very bad caliphs. We've got to face the fact that history is full of examples of wicked caliphs. It's full of examples of great caliphs, of generous caliphs, of impious caliphs. All human experience is there. That doesn't mean that the institution is necessarily bad. It just means that there are lots of bad examples as well as good ones. And that's one of the things that history teaches us, that we should continue to be optimistic, we continue to strive for the good, but we should be aware that there are bad examples in the past, and tragically, there will probably be bad examples in the future as well.
Jamal?
Yeah, I mean, exactly. There were, from the earliest generation, a number of the early caliphs were promised paradise. So we can't have any question of their character. But they were human, meaning they can make mistakes. The point is that with this rich history, with this rich tapestry, which we can see over this 1,000+ years, we have incredible examples of piety and at the other end of the scale. But the point is that when we talk about caliphal bringing it back, this is what people might think about, and they'll say, oh, do you want to have an Ottoman caliphate? Or is it an Abbasid model? Or is it this? No, we go according to the Hadith. Khilafa ala manhaj nabuwah, on the basis of prophethood. Meaning the sources of text of law is the Quran and Sunnah. Yes, we indicate from that the ijma of the Sahaba and us. But the point is it is sourced in the Quran and Sunnah. So the caliphate model is derived from that, meaning the rules and structures and all of these matters has to be based upon that. That's a solid foundation. Yes, we will look at the good and we'll look at the bad and we will understand and we will learn by that. But that's not the model that we use. So we're not going to say, oh, Harun al-Rashid, with all our great respect to him, is not a source of law. He's a good example in terms of some of the things he did. You know, the source of law is one thing, some administrative adoptions are another, we learn from, but the source of law is absolutely key when we define the structure and the basis of this state.
Thank you very much, Jamal. Professor Kennedy, bringing the event to an end now, I would like to both of you to give some very brief concluding points in response to the question which was posed today. Is the Caliphate a viable solution for the Middle East? Jamal.
Yes, again, I would like to thank everyone for attending this evening. I think it's been a very lively and interesting discussion. I'd like to thank Hugh Kennedy again for sparing us some time and to pass some of the examples of his wisdom and undoubted research matter. The question is it a viable alternative? And I would say yes, it is. And I think the responsibility is that we have, because mostly Muslims in this room today, and then others who obviously have some interest in the subject, it's our responsibility to say that these problems that we are experiencing in the Middle East in particular, we need to share in that, because we are part of an ummah, of a nation, which has gone into a period of decline. Now, maybe we can say that that decline has been arrested and is returning back, and that we are seeing a revival in Islam, a revival in people's adherence to Islam and its seriousness about Islam in terms of all of its requirements. But with this revival, we need to be part of that. We need to be engaged in terms of not just studying our history, not just understanding the good and the bad of parts of that history, but also in terms of what Islam is actually requesting us to do today, which is that we need to be part of a movement which is seeking to change that reality so that we can make a new caliphate a new reality, because it will require people like yourselves, myself, others, actually take this on with seriousness. So I hope that you take that away with you today, this thought in terms of saying that accepting this current reality as the people in the Middle East were not prepared to do means that we should not also be accepting as well. And in that case, we should be seeking this caliphate as solution.
Professor Kennedy.
Yes, I would like to thank Jamal for giving us, and indeed the whole organisation of this, for giving us an opportunity to debate these issues, and for Jamal to providing such a persuasive view of how caliphate could work. I'm more cautious. I'm the viable that I'm struggling with here. I think that it's as well to be aware that all sorts of pitfalls and these problems can, I'm sure, be overcome, but they are real problems, and it would depend crucially, and I'm speaking obviously as an idea here, it depends crucially on a level of tolerance and understanding and respect for different opinions, which is often difficult to generate in human societies. It doesn't mean that it can't be done, but it needs to be done with care and perceptiveness about these differences, the basis of these differences, the genuineness of these differences. And in that sort of approach, I think the idea of Khilafah has a lot for going for it, but it's going to be tricky. I think that's my final word. But thank you very much for the audience, for the questions, and as I say, thank you very much from Ahmad and others for arranging this.
Thank you very much, and I'd like to... So, ladies and gentlemen, I think this is all for this evening. Prayer space is available for Maghrib upstairs. Any requests that, if you want to ask the speakers any questions, that they can be approached at the back of the room or outside. So please don't bombard them here, inshallah. Jazakallahu khair. May Allah bless you all in this life and the next. Ameen.